The most watched podcast Joe Rogan has ever uploaded is not a political episode. It's not a scientist, a comedian, or a celebrity. It's a quiet, reluctant physicist from Nevada who says he spent 6 months in 1988 working on technology that wasn't built by anyone on this planet.
Joe?
You are still to this date the most watched ever podcast we have ever done that's on YouTube.
That's just unreal.
His name is Bob Lazar, and for almost 40 years, he has told the same story. Not a version of it, not an evolved, expanded, elaborated version. The exact same story. Every interview, every decade, the exact same details. What's new is that for the first time, those details exist somewhere other than Bob Lazar's memory. A filmmaker spent 5.5 years and millions of dollars building what Bob described. Every corridor, every hangar door, every material, the reactor, the craft itself. And when Bob finally saw it, he said it looked like Luigi had downloaded it straight out of his brain. This is what they built, and this is why it's extraordinary. To understand why this documentary matters, you have to understand something about Bob Lazar that is unusual for someone in his position. He does not enjoy this. He has said repeatedly, and the JRE episode confirms it, that he doesn't like public attention, doesn't like doing interviews, and has spent decades actively trying to push this experience out of his mind. He describes it as a burden, something he carries but doesn't want to carry. He said on this episode that it's always tough to bring it back, that it was a very stressful time and still is.
I've really worked for decades to push this out of my mind, so it's always tough to bring it back, and talk about it.
Most people who fabricate stories get more comfortable with them over time. They enjoy the attention, they elaborate, they tour the convention circuit, they monetize. Lazar drives a 2018 Chevy Bolt that cost him $18,000. He lives on 10 acres in the mountains. He runs a scientific supply company called United Nuclear. He says if someone wants to give him millions of dollars, please contact him immediately. This is not the profile of a man who built a lie and wrote it. The film at the center of this episode is called S4, the Bob Lazar story. Luigi Venditelli, the filmmaker, is the other person in the room. He spent 5.5 years building what Bob described. Not mostly with AI, 90% of it is handmade CGI in a program called Blender. The craft, the hangar, the facility, the people, all constructed by hand.
Just want to say there's about 10% AI in the film, but there's 90% Blender, and that's actually handmade CGI. So everything you see is all handmade. And even the de-aging of Bob Lazar, we scanned Bob, we went over to his house, scanned his face, took a process of de-aging him through that, then creating a digital model of Bob in different ages, and then placing him in the environment.
They scanned Bob's face, built a digital model of him at different ages, placed him in the environments he had described, and then, critically, they didn't show him the work until close to the end. The reason matters. Luigi wanted the build to be driven entirely by what Bob had said, not by what Bob approved. If he showed Lazar things too early, Bob might start remembering things based on what he saw rather than what he actually experienced. So for years, Bob would call. Luigi would say it's not ready. Bob would push. Luigi would hold. When Luigi finally started showing him completed sections, something unexpected happened. Bob started remembering things he had completely forgotten. Details that had been dormant for decades came back, triggered by seeing a rendered version of a corridor or a room he hadn't consciously accessed in years.
It really made a big difference when he showed me some things and, walking down the corridor here and turn, oh, stop, wait, there's another door there. I mean, it was like I was going back into the facility and really brought, actually seeing it again, really brought some things back that I had completely forgotten about. So
he described it as being teleported back there. When he put on the VR goggles and moved through the digital recreation of S4 in 3 dimensions, he said the hair stood up on his arms. Luigi is not a credulous person. He is a technical filmmaker who spent years stress testing a story he was committing his professional reputation to, and in that process, 2 specific details convinced him that Lazar could not have been making this up. The first was the darkness. Lazar had always said it was very dark inside the craft. Even though there were lights, large industrial halogen lights on tripods, it was dark. Luigi's team built the interior. They put in the correct lights for 1988, the type used on American military bases at the time. they turned them on, it was still dark.
Can't see anything. He's like, they're fully on. And I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's so dark in there.
Yeah,
I remember thinking,
it
shit,
consumes light in there.
and so we upped the power of the light so that you could see more. And it was still dark.
The reason, when they worked it out, had to do with the material of the craft's interior. The specific reflectivity and specularity of the skin, what they eventually settled on as an unpolished stainless steel with a particular texture, absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The ceiling would catch some of the upward-pointing halogens. The rest would just disappear into the material. To get the craft interior visible enough to film, they had to increase the light intensity 20-fold. This is not something you would know from description. You would have to build it. A person inventing a story who says there are 4 powerful halogen spotlights in there would not then say it was really dark. The darkness only becomes apparent when you actually construct the environment and put lights in it. Lazar described the darkness in 1989. Luigi confirmed it in 2025. The second detail was the American flag. Lazar said the very first time he walked into the hangar, he slid his hand along the craft and noticed a reversed American flag on the hull. Detractors had said for decades that this was physically impossible, that at Bob's height, looking up at a craft of that size, he simply could not have seen a sticker near the top of the shell. Luigi built the hangar, built the craft at its actual dimensions, 52 feet in diameter, set the virtual camera at Lazar's height, and when he put on the goggles and walked into the virtual hangar for the first time, the first thing he said was, "There it is, the flag." You could see it clearly. It was there exactly as described.
I said, at 5'10", I'm Bob's height with the goggles, I want to see. And the first thing I said is, oh, there it is. And they're like, there what is? I said, the flag. And they thought I was pointing at a flag on a wall. And they're like, there's no flag in the hangar. I said, no, on the craft. And they're like, yeah? I said, you can clearly see it. It was clear. That was something that also made me go, yeah, this is it. This is the real size. So had Bob Lazar...
For a filmmaker who had spent years looking for the gap in the story, the thing that wouldn't line up, these two moments landed differently than any argument. They were physical realities you could only discover by building, and they matched. The craft Lazar was working on in 1988 was approximately 52 feet in diameter. He nicknamed it the sport model because of its clean, seamless appearance. There were no welds, no bolts, no seams anywhere on the exterior. The entire structure appeared to be a single, continuous piece, as if it had been grown rather than assembled. Inside, there were 3 amplifiers and a reactor that sat at the bottom of the craft beneath a small dome. Attached to the reactor were 3 emitters, large pipe-like structures that could rotate. When you rotated an emitter approximately 20 degrees, it would connect to the reactor and begin to produce a field. That field repelled the craft from the ground, not by pushing against it, but by canceling its own weight entirely. Lazar said he walked underneath the hovering craft and felt nothing. No pressure, no sense of weight being transferred to the floor. It simply had no weight.
Suspending itself above the ground, and I went underneath it. You would think it's translating its weight onto the ground and pushing, and I should be
Squashed.
without any doubt, but I'm not. There's no feeling there at all. So it's not translating its weight or its push.
The fuel was element 115. At the time Lazar described this in 1989, element 115 did not officially exist. It was not synthesized in a laboratory until 2003. It was not formally confirmed by the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry until 2015, when it was named moscovium. Lazar said the element was physically present at the facility in significant quantities, machined into a specific triangular shape, and that when placed in the reactor and bombarded with radiation in a process that resembled a cyclotron, it produced a field that bent gravity. He told this to George Knapp in 1989. The element he described didn't exist in any lab on Earth until 14 years later. One of the things Rogan raised in this episode, and it's the thing that makes Lazar's story progressively harder to dismiss, is the UAP footage. In 2017, the New York Times published a front-page story on the Pentagon's classified UAP program. It included footage from U.S. Navy fighter jets showing craft that behaved in ways that conventional physics cannot explain. One of the most famous sequences shows an object rotating so that its belly faces the direction of travel and then accelerating away. That is exactly how Bob Lazar described the sport model moving in 1989. The belly-down orientation, the rotation, the acceleration. He described the propulsion system producing a gravitational field underneath the craft that it essentially falls into, which would explain why the craft needs to face its underside toward the direction of travel to move. He described this 28 years before the Navy footage was declassified. Rogan's observation on this was direct. He said, "It's exactly what you described, all those years ago." And Lazar's response was quiet. He said, "That's the way it was."
The belly roll faces at the bottom towards where it's want to go, and then it takes off. And yeah.
It's exactly how you described all those years ago, which is really fucking crazy.
Well, that's the way it was.
Beyond the craft itself, Luigi revealed something in this episode that had not been made public before. His researcher found an official U.S. Department of the Interior map of the Papoose Lake area, the location where Bob Lazar said S4 was situated, dating from 1941. On that map, there is a road. It runs directly into the hillside at exactly the location Lazar identified as the entrance to S4. By 1950 and 1952, the road was gone, removed from all subsequent maps.
And those roads were removed. But the oldest map we ever found, it's going to be available. We're going to post it on our website. It's going to be everywhere. It shows clear as day a road that goes right into the mountain exactly where Bob Lazar said S4 was.
So do you think that that was the road to the silver mine initially?
Yes, I believe that, yeah.
It makes sense that they would use an existing facility and just enlarge it instead of start from nothing.
The most likely explanation is that the road originally led to a silver mine, one that had been operating in that location before the area was taken over. When the CIA assumed control of the broader area in the 1950s, they removed the road from official maps, but the infrastructure was already there. A tunnel already drilled into a hillside is a much easier starting point for an underground facility than starting from nothing. If the recovery at Roswell in 1947 was real, the timeline fits precisely. A facility built in an existing mine structure in the early 1950s. Decades of research. A program that had been running for nearly 40 years by the time Lazar arrived in 1988. Toward the end of the episode, the conversation turned to something Lazar has said increasingly in recent years. Something that is genuinely surprising coming from the man who made this story public in the first place. He said he is not sure it was the right thing to do. Not because he is recanting, not because the story isn't real, but because he has spent 40 years watching a parade of people agree across administrations, across decades, across classifications, to keep this quiet. And he said that many of those people are not idiots. They are serious, thoughtful people who have looked at what this technology represents and decided, collectively, that the world is not ready for it.
Maybe this is supposed to be just kept quiet.
Yeah, but that doesn't ring true. Because I don't think it's ever healthy if small groups of individuals have information that would change our understanding of where we are.
Yeah, there's that.
His reasoning is specific and unsettling. This is a technology that, if it could be replicated, would be world-dominating. It is a propulsion system, a power source, and potentially a weapons delivery system simultaneously. In a world where human beings are still flying over patches of dirt and bombing each other repeatedly, he said plainly, he is not sure we should be trusted with this. Then he said something that is probably the most honest thing you will ever hear from someone in his position. He said, maybe they are right. Maybe this is supposed to stay quiet. And then he immediately said, but that doesn't ring true either, because he doesn't believe a small group of people should permanently hold information that would change every human being's understanding of where we are. Both things, at the same time, from the same person. That is not a man performing. That is a man who has been living with something for 40 years and still doesn't know what to do with it. The craft is still somewhere. The technology still exists. The research presumably continues. And Bob Lazar, who touched element 115 with his bare hands in a hangar in the Nevada desert in 1988, still drives an $18,000 electric car and grows food in a greenhouse. Some secrets are harder to carry than others.